reading from Matthew's Gospel. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all of the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, "Well, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is so written and has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Well, then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may go and pay him homage." Well, when they heard the king, that they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and they paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Thus ends the reading of the word.
Thanks be to God.
Today is Epiphany Sunday. Epiphany, that refers to a striking appearance, a manifestation of something, something revealed. Matthew's story of the visiting wise men is a testament, a witnessing event of strangers, of Gentiles for that matter, to the arrival of God's Holy One, the Messiah. It could also be called Theophany Sunday. Theophany Sunday, which refers to the revealing of the Son of God and the Christ child, but that word sounds like you're sneezing, so that's probably why we opted for Epiphany. Christian churches in the West commemorate the visitation of the Magi on this Sunday. That's us. Whereas Christian churches in the East, not on the East Coast, on the East, the very East, commemorate the baptism of Jesus at the Jordan River on this day. We will commemorate that event next week. Matthew's account of the special visitors is the only such account in the gospel narrative. My guess is that all of the stories written about this story have been written to try to make sense out of the tale. In our Christmas pageant, we dress the children up as kings, bearing costly gifts, perpetuating the idea about there being three men who have governments to run, showing up on Herod's doorstep looking for another one of their ilk. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, these visitors were viewed as kings, and by the 6th century, they had names. Bithysaria, Melchior, and Cathaspa. Say that 4 times. Some even associated these three with Shem and Ham and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah, and thus they were identified with Asia, Africa, and Europe. It was in the 14th century that an Armenian tradition came into being, had identified them with the names Balthazar, king of Asia, Melchior, king of Persia, and Gaspar, king of India. But the term magoi, transliterated from the Greek into the Latin magi, doesn't mean king. It is the word from which our word magician comes. And it refers to teachers, to priests, to physicians, to astrologers, to seers, to interpreters of dreams, to diviners and prophets and soothsayers and sorcerers. Much like the hereditary priests of Judaism, descended from Moses' brother Aaron, called Levites, these magi were likely members of the hereditary priesthood of the Medes, Median priests. Today, they are known as the Kurds. These Median priests were credited with profound and extraordinary religious knowledge. Because of their ability to interpret dreams, the great emperor Darius established these priests over the state religion of Persia. That was 550 years before the Common Era. Matthew's visitors were these very knowledgeable men, these interpreters of dreams and these interpreters of heavenly signs. Magi, well, they were the ultimate former-day multitaskers, always watching and attentive to the world around them. Astronomers watching the skies, watching the heavens, watching the planets and the stars, charting their movements through the skies. Astrologers examining the meaning behind the movements of the planets and the stars. Observers of everything going on about them in the natural world. They were priests, too, recognizing the infinite and awe-inspiring acts of the divine, which are beyond the realm of human reasoning, yet must be treasured in the human heart that is aware of them. You may be wondering why I chose the title of Wandering Tributaries for my sermon. You probably think I was talking about rivers. It's because I wanted us to get away from the images of kings. The word tribute comes from the Latin verb tribuere, meaning to grant, to bestow, to yield, to give up, to concede, to allow. For example, every year on April the 15th, we bestow a tribute to our governor. The importance of this story isn't about royalty visiting royalty, or the great visiting the poor in the manger. It has to be more than some elaborate baby shower. We have reduced the story to one about three guys with crowns on their heads dropping off some very high-end gifts at Mary and Joseph's house just a few days before the family is forced to flee the country. I have referred to the Magi as wandering tributaries because they have spent weeks, if not months, on their journey. Much like searching for that elusive pot of gold, the leprechaun's story, that sits at the end of the rainbow. These Magi are searching for the one their scholarly work has told them is arriving at the appointed time. Matthew uses them as the unimpeachable witnesses of the Christ event. In 1895, Henry Van Dyke, I assume, had a similar feeling about what had happened to the story of the wise men as I had. So he wrote another story. He called his story The Other Wise Men. And the reason he wrote this story was because when we tell this story out of Matthew, we have a tendency to say, well, the wise men showed up, dropped off their gifts, left, and went back to, same old, same old. That can't be the end of the story. So Henry Van Dyke wrote this story called The Other Wise Men. It's the story of a brilliant, knowledgeable, priestly man who, with his companions, had studied the ancient writings and the heavens and believed that the Divine One was about to do something extraordinary. He was a Persian priest, philosopher, teacher, physician. All of the signs that he and his companions had studied pointed to something incredible happening. And when the sign that they had all been looking for appeared in the heavens, they agreed that they would meet and make the journey to Judea together, to a foreign country together. Van Dyke named his wise man Artaban and gave his horse a name. His horse's name was Vazda. And when he saw the star, when Artaban saw the star in the sky, he mounted his horse Vazda and he rode through the rocky wilderness terrain. He rode for 10 days to reach Babylon, where their journey together would begin on the way to Jerusalem. He was nearly there when he and Vazda came across a man lying on the road. Artaban dismounted and went over to the man. His physician's skills told him that this poor Hebrew man who had been left to still live in the Mesopotamian Assyrian Empire after the exile and after the Israelites had gone home, he was still living there, a poor man in Babylon. And this Hebrew man was so close to death, dying of swamp fever, that Artaban felt there was nothing he could really do to help him. He turned to leave the man to nature when the man reached out and grabbed the hem of his garment. Artaban was torn. He was conflicted. He had prepared for this journey to see the newborn king for months. He had sold all of his possessions to buy 3 great jewels to give to the one who was to be God's Savior of the world. A brilliant blue sapphire, a priceless red ruby, and a giant shimmering pearl. He could not leave the dying man, however, and as anxious as he was, he picked him up and he carried him to the base of the tree where he fed him and he gave him healing medicines. And he sat with him for many, many hours, until the man had regained some of his strength. He told the man of his journey, the one he had planned, of his hopes to find the newborn king. And Artaban finally left him and left him the remainder of his food and his wine and more healing medicine. But as he left, the Hebrew man told him of the ancient Hebrew writings that said God's Savior would be born in Bethlehem of Judea, not in Jerusalem. Artaban could not hope to catch up with his companions with a horse that was spent from 10 days of rough travel. So he sold the sapphire to buy a camel and supplies to get him across the desert and on to Bethlehem. He finally arrived at the quiet little town and began searching for the child. The streets were deserted. He found a house where the door was open and found a mother and her infant child inside. She served him a meal and she spoke of his companions who had come to see Mary and Joseph's baby. But they had already left a few days before, and the couple left soon after with their newborn. Suddenly, there were shrill cries in the streets as King Herod's soldiers came through the town with orders to kill all of the infant boys. And Artaban stood in the doorway of the house, and when Artaban said, "There is no child here," and offered the captain his ruby. The captain snatched it from his hand and told his soldiers to march on. Artaban journeyed to Egypt in search of the child still, and months of searching turned into years. And as he found himself in the company of the poor and the desolate, the imprisoned and the sick, he tended to them, and he cared for them, never giving up on his quest to find the child. 33 years had passed. He had managed to keep the giant pearl close to his heart to present it to the king when he finally found him. He was an old man the day he arrived in Jerusalem, where there was much commotion in the streets. It was the Hebrew celebration of the Passover, and people were clamoring to leave the city through the Damascus gate. And he asked what was happening, and people said, "Well, they're crucifying 2 thieves and a man who calls himself the King of the Jews." And Artaban began to imagine that this might be the one that he had been looking for. He still had the pearl, and he might offer it to the Roman procurator or the Roman soldiers to save his king. He might be the one that Artaban had been searching for all these years. But suddenly, there were 2 Roman soldiers dragging a young woman from her home to be sold into slavery to pay for her father's debts. And Artaban was torn yet again, wanting to run out through the Damascus gate to the place of the crucifixion to save the king, when the young woman cried out, "Have pity on me." He took out the final jewel, that giant pearl, that now shone with a luminescence of blue and pink, as if carrying within it the colors of the sapphire and the ruby that he had given away. And he handed the pearl to the young woman. In that moment, there was a giant earthquake that shook the earth so violently that the 2 Roman soldiers dropped the young woman and ran for their lives. Artaban was struck on the head by a falling tile and lay dying in the arms of the young woman he had rescued. In that moment, as he grieved, never having found the newborn king, he heard a still small voice saying, "When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you took me in. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you healed me. When I was in prison, you visited me." Artaban said, "But I never have seen your face." And the voice answered, "Inasmuch as you have cared for the least of my brothers and sisters, so too you have cared for me." When we wonder if our life has meaning, it doesn't hurt to listen to that still small voice that is speaking to us. We love the story of The Greatest Gift, written by Philip Van Doren Stern in 1939. It's the story of a man whose life is in ruins, whose business has floundered, bankrupted by human error. His losses just seem to compound, and he sees himself as a man who was never able to realize his dreams, who looks upon his life as a series of missed opportunities and decides to end it. We all know him as George Bailey, and he looks a lot like Jimmy Stewart, because we watch the movie based on the story every year at Christmas time. It is as much a part of our Christmas season as Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I invite us to make the story of the other wise men part of our Christmas as well.